I trust in you. Lord, I trust in you. I believe you're my healer. And I believe you are all I need. Oh, yes, you are, Jesus. I believe you're my portion. I believe you're more than enough for me. Jesus, you're all I need. Oh.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Heart to Heart Talk Show. And today I'll be dealing with the topic of dealing with loss, grief in its sense. So I'm Natoya Campbell Broomfield, and I do hope that this presentation will be beneficial to everybody. Let's get started. Let's get right into it. So the topic I'll be dealing with today is dealing with the loss and becoming resilient. What is grief? Grief refers to deep sorrow, especially it is caused by someone's death, miscarriage, loss of job, and loss of relationships. There are many reasons why folks would suffer grief, and none of us can say that we have not experienced grief at some point or another. And so there are many reasons why persons experience grief. One, miscarriages. Now, a mother who has lost a child, it is hard for her to handle. And so this person may go into shock, first of all, and they will try not to accept the fact that this thing has happened. However, miscarriage does contribute to persons suffering grief. Loss of loved ones. We do understand, especially in this season when this virus, COVID, is taking our loved ones left, right, and center. We can relate to the loss of someone and how it makes us feel. We all suffer grief. Loss of relationships. This can be love relationship or friendships. Lots of a job, and especially in this COVID period, lots of individuals have lost their jobs, and I'm sure many persons, even as we speak, are experiencing or suffering grief. Loss of a position in church, and these are some of the reasons. They may not be all the reasons, but these are some of the common reasons why folks would experience grief. Loss of opportunities, loss of properties and assets, whether by fire or by natural disaster. There are so many reasons why individuals will suffer grief. And even in this period of COVID, many persons are experiencing loss of health. And these factors contribute to one, suffering grief. One of the most challenging parts of living life is losing what is most important to us, or losing an important person we love. The agony and grief can feel like an ever-present weight that encompasses every instant. Managing grief managing grief in a healthy way can be fought. Everyone processes loss and grief differently. Healing transpires at different rates. Some people feel that certain forms of grieving are disrespectful to those we have lost. Despite this, the most important part of handling grief is realizing that there is no single correct way to do it. There's no timing. There's no single correct way to do it, right? So when we look at miscarriage, we're going to be looking at each of the points that I mentioned earlier, not all of them, but some of the most common ones. And we looked at miscarriage. And here's a quote from Washington Irving. There is a sacredness in tears. They're not the mark of weakness, but of power. They speak more eloquently than 10,000 tongues. They're the messengers of overwhelming grief, of deep contrition, and of unspeakable love. The love that a mother has for even an unborn child, it cannot be compared to love that we have in this natural life. And so when a mother suffers a miscarriage and they begin to experience grief, it can be one that is very difficult to handle. Then we look at grieving the loss of loved ones, the loss of loved ones. We all can relate to this. Whether it's direct or indirect, we all know somebody that has passed on. And some of us were close to these individuals. And so we suffer the grief as much as the persons that they're directly involved with. Here is what Henry Wadsworth says. Believe me, every heart has its secret sorrows, which the world knows not. And oftentimes we call a man cold when he is only sad. Because of course, sadness is a part of grieving. We speak of loss of relationships, whether friendship or love relationship. You never know how much you love someone until you watch them love someone else. Sometimes it's as a result of them loving someone else while we suffer grief. Sometimes it's just misunderstandings that leads to us losing a relationship. Whatever way it goes, we never know the depth of pain until we have lost those relationships. Loss of jobs. And as we mentioned before, that even in this period of COVID, many persons have lost their jobs. Many persons don't know where the next meal is coming from. Many persons don't know how their bills are going to be paid. And as a result of this, individuals will suffer some level of grief. John Steinbeck says, it's so much darker when a light goes out than it would have been if it had never shone. We never know the depth of pain until we get into it, until we have to face it. We never know the depth of grief until we experience it. And I believe that's what John Steinbeck was saying in this statement when he says, we don't know darker days until we experience it. Now, when anyone experiences grief, they go through a process. And it is important that each and every one of us that grieve, that we go through the process. It's healthy that we go through the process. When you lose someone you love, it's hard to imagine life without them. Every loss comes with pain. Every loss comes with adjustments we need to make. You are not alone. And knowing the 7 stages of grief might help you to see light at the end of the tunnel. The 7 stages of grief, let's go through them. Shock and denial. Usually in hearing of somebody dying or hearing of any form of bad news that concerns us, the first thing you're gonna do is to go into shock. Did this really happen? Am I really going through this? This is a state of disbelief, and all sorts of feelings take you over. You cry. Some persons will holler, as we would say in Jamaica, but you go into shock and you begin to deny that this is happening. And I can relate because I'm in the health system, and every day I see it, where individuals will hear of the passing of their loved ones, or a husband will hear of the passing of his child. And the first thing they say, no, this is not happening to me. This cannot happen. They're in denial. Then, of course, the second stage is where the pain and the guilt steps in. It's because I did this. If I had done this, this would not have happened. You try to justify every possible way that you could help to allow the situation not to be where it is. And so the pain and the guilt and the anger kicks in. Then the anger and the bargaining. What if I had done more? What if I had given a little bit more money? You start bargaining. And then, of course, the next step is depression. You stop eating. You don't even want to follow through on your personal hygiene, brush your teeth. Some people stop sleeping. The depression kicks in, and all the signs of depression starts coming out. Then, of course, the upward turn. And the upward turn is where the individual is beginning to see things differently. And then, of course, they start to reconstruct the situation so they're able to work through it. And when we get to the final stage, which is the acceptance, that is what is going to give us hope. Because, okay, that is gone. Okay, my wife is gone. How do I go on? And we either turn to, living for Christ, going to church, getting involved in social activities, but we find ways because we now accept what is happening in our lives. Now, I want to share 6 tips that will help us cope with grieving. Because like I said, none of us were immune to grief. And so because I have been there, I can relate to grief in its purest form. I have experienced it. And so out of my experience and based on what I've read of other person's experiences, there are 6 tips that can help us to cope with this grief. Most of us understand that grief is normal and inevitable after a major loss. But the duration of grief is not as well understood. Many people think that it should last for a year, but no more. Some people think it may last for a while, but should feel much easier after the first couple of weeks. What are we doing here? Don't put time limits on your grief. That's number 1. Do not put time limits on your grief because you don't know how long it will last. Just go through the process. Unfortunately, I don't think there's any way to know how long your grief should last. It's important to acknowledge this inherent uncertainty instead of fighting against it by putting artificial deadlines on your grief, which often backfires. Just allow yourself to go through the process. Do not put time limits on your grief. The second point or the second step is to resist comparing your grief to the grief of others or to others' grief. No two situations are the same. In the age of social media, it's all too easy to equate our grief and the grieving process to that of others. We see a brother going through something. Oh, I'm going through the same thing. And you think that you should do it the same way, go through the grieving process the same way they are going through it. No. This urge to compare and contrast our grief with others is natural. It's innate. We're social creatures. And we crave the knowledge that we're experiencing. It isn't completely foreign or outside the norm. This means it's not surprising when we find ourselves wishing we could get on with life as quickly as possible. Or wondering why our co-workers was able to so quickly bounce back after being laid off and start applying for a new job. So, sometimes when persons experience grief, one will bounce back in a month, The other will bounce back in 5 months. Another person may bounce back in a year, whereas it might take you 5 years. So there are no real time limits on how soon you will bounce back from grief. So don't compare yourself to others. But the act of comparing our grief to that of others and then judging it accordingly usually is not helpful. So what I want to say to you, don't compare your grief with the grief of others, because the way how I handle my grief is not the way how you might handle it. And the time it takes for me to get over it might not be the same for you. And so allow yourself to naturally go through the process. The third step, or the third point, is spend time grieving intentionally. Sounds strange, don't it? But though this one sounds strange, it is based on the key idea in the mechanics of emotions. And for those of us who we have been through psychology, we will know about the emotions and how they work. What we resist persists. Trying to avoid difficult emotions only makes them stronger in the long run. When our minds see us fighting or running away from the situation, including an emotion like sadness, for example, it learns to see that thing as a threat. This means the next time something triggers your sadness, your mind is going to go on high alert, increasing your anxiety and overall level of emotionality. What am I saying? If you face it, go through it intentionally. Tell yourself, I'm grieving and I'm going to go through this process no matter how long it takes. Because when you run away from it, in the back of your mind, your brain is going to store that information. And as soon as you experience something of this nature, right away, you're on high alert and everything puts you in grief. And so you want to make sure that you intentionally go through the process. The fourth step, seek out the right kind of social support. And even in this COVID period, there are lots of social groups, lots of governmental groups that are offering support for grief. And this is good because a lot of persons don't realize how dangerous grief can be and the long-term effect of grief. The key mistake people make is that they assume social media support. Social support means talking to other people precisely about their grief or loss. You don't have to get into the depth of it. You don't have to get into the details of it, but just joining a support group, just getting involved with church, just going to the community center, getting involved with somebody or some groups helps you to cope, helps you to go through the process. You don't have to discuss what is happening with you to anybody, right? But getting involved outside of your sad environment can help you cope with the situation, right? And so sometimes having draining dialogues with persons can put you into even more sadness, but it does help when you can talk to somebody. Seeing a professional counselor or therapist can help. And while intentionally talking about and sharing your grief can be obliging for some people at certain stages, that's not the only way to get social support while you're grieving. Because you're grieving doesn't mean you have to talk. There's a little error there, that's fine. But I'll explain. So because you're grieving, it doesn't mean you have to talk about what you're grieving or what you're going through all the time. Sometimes just reminiscing on old times, reminiscing on the memories, help you to go through the grief. Sometimes sharing things in the present can help you to go through the grief. Simply being connected is what is most important during the grief. So, like I said, just going out there, getting involved in a community center, getting involved in a youth group, getting involved in church activities, just being in another environment other than the sad environment you're in can help you to cope with grieving. And underappreciated, and we're looking at the sixth point and the final point, which is taking time to care for yourself. Self-care is of utmost importance when you experience grief or going through grief. An underappreciated part of healthy grieving is taking care of self, especially your body. When loss and grief strike, your life is understandably thrown into disarray and disorder. From legal and logistical issues to social and emotional changes, grief can be chaotic. And like I said, I've been there, so I know exactly what I'm saying to you. Unfortunately, amid the chaos and confusion of grief, many people let go of healthy habits and routines they normally engage in. Ironically, this makes it harder to navigate your grief well. Take time to exercise, take time to sleep, take time to eat a balanced diet, go out with friends and family, and get involved in a social group if possible. Try to do the things you used to do before you fall into this diverse situation. Because you know what? It is natural, it is normal, and it's also a part of the process to forget about yourself when you're going through grief. But here, I'm saying to you, take care of yourself. I was stuck in this place for a while because when I experience grief, not just with sickness, not just with the loss of a loved one, but I was stuck in this position for a while because I forgot about me. I forgot about what I needed. And I also forgot about the persons around me, my immediate family. So I had to take time to take care of me. And that is how I managed to get back to who I used to be. So, in a nutshell, grief affects everyone, but we can get through it. And so healthy grief means embracing the full range of emotions it contains with compassion and understanding. None of us are immune to grief. We all experience grief at some point or another. But becoming resilient is allowing ourselves to naturally go through the process and find peace and solace in Christ Jesus. He understands pain more than any one of us can. So he's the best option in coping with grief while we follow the recommendations in the natural. Thank you for listening. I do hope this information was beneficial and will be beneficial to those who come in contact with it. But like I said, all of us experience grief and we're not immune to it. So you pray for me while I pray for you, and let's help each other get through the process. Thank you.